The Dali News. Time stretches on. All the news artist Salvador Dalí wants you to see. Dateline Hollywood, November 1945. World-famous surrealist painter Salvador Dalí and animation pioneer Walt Disney have reached a decision to produce a surrealist animated film in a new medium never yet tried. A film Dalí describes as the first motion picture of the never seen before.
Salvador Dalí and Walt Disney together on a project, it was very, very strange because I believe that it's two opposite persons.
Salvador Dalí was considered the crazy modern artist by the general public. Walt Disney was the great animated cartoon maker.
It's just so on the face of it absurd. Walt over here with dancing fairies and things, and here's Dalí over here with the blackness of nightmares. How did they come together?
Two great artists at the peak of their powers, thinking they're going to do great, great things. The tragedy is Destino was a casualty of the financial pressures of the studio.
The project disappeared so deeply that when they came upon the art many years later in the archives,
it was like somebody uncovering a Van Gogh up in their attic that they didn't know they had.
The only Dalí material in the world that's never been seen by the public.
Roy really inspired me with his interest in the art.
It was a very personal thing. I really wanted to do this and to experiment with the medium again.
There was a period of history that was incomplete, and now it's complete. You can finish off the story of Destino.
My heart was sad and lonely.
All of Hollywood was very intrigued by this idea of Walt Disney and Salvador Dalí working together on a project, because the way they visualized these two artists, they visualized them as totally different personalities.
Salvador Dalí and Walt Disney, they are also a big talent. I believe they decide to work together.
Dalí was bigger than life, you know, in a million ways, and so was Walt. And they recognized something in each other that was common ground.
They were both immensely talented. They loved drawing, they loved magic, and they loved animation. It was interesting how many similarities there were.
Walt Disney was born in 1901 in Chicago, Illinois. 3 years later, and halfway around the world, Salvador Dalí was born in the small town of Figueres, Spain.
Walt Disney had a very difficult childhood. His father was a very tough man. Elias Disney was one of these guys who didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't laugh very much, kept his nose to the grindstone. A father who was very tough, unforgiving, and in some ways unloving. Walt found his release in art. He loved to draw from the time he was a little boy. As he got into grade school, he was always drawing. He was the artist for the high school magazine, and he drew attention by the fact that he was a very good artist.
Dali's father was a very strong man. He was very strict. He was conservative. He wanted Dali to become a teacher of art. The first painting of Dali was painted when he was 6 years old. Dali wanted to be the center of attention of all the students in the school. Dali was aware that he will become a very famous artist. He wrote that in 20, so he was 16 years old.
Walt Disney came to animation relatively young. He was a teenager when he first started animating, and then started his own animation studio before he was 21. Walt Disney's film studio went bankrupt, but he got right back up and started another film studio, this time in California. And in that studio, he met some difficulties. A character that he had designed, Oswald the Rabbit, was taken away from him by the distributor, and Walt was left with nothing. But once again, he got right up and created Mickey Mouse.
Disney's whole drive seemed to be to tell stories that would move you from the daily mundane realities to this magical experience. And I think Dali was engaged in that same process, is trying to remove you from this daily tedium to something much more fantastic.
Dali was very ambitious, he was very talented, and he was very successful. He had his first one-man exhibition in Barcelona in 1925, when he was just 21. And for the next 2 or 3 years, he became really central to a very lively Catalan avant-garde in Barcelona, Figueres, Sitges. Dali was gripped with an absolute passion for Freud while he was in Madrid as a student, about 1924, 1925. He read the interpretation of dreams. He interpreted his own dreams like mad. He became very accomplished about psychoanalytical ideas, symbols, and dreams.
When Walt lost Oswald, one of the lessons he learned from that was that you have to control everything. You have to own your characters. You have to own your studio. Walt formed the Disney Brothers studio, and when he moved to Hyperion in Glendale, he was determined to create this paradise.
Walt was trying to create a perfect world, I suppose.
Walt was always about this notion that you could return to some sort of idealized place. For Walt, the idealized place was Marceline, Missouri, where he spent a few years of his very young life. It was a farm town, and he was only there for a handful of years. But those were seminal years for him. Years he remembered very, very, very fondly. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch, psychologically, to say that Walt Disney spent the better part of his life trying to either recreate Marceline in various ways, either in animation or physically, as he does in Main Street at Disneyland. That sense of home, that sense of place, that sense of peace, that sense of security.
When you come in the main gate, past the railroad station, straight ahead lies the heartline of America. Hometown, USA, just after the turn of the century.
He said, you know, Grandpa Taylor's barn burned down in Marceline when I was about 5 or 6, and I thought the whole world was on fire. I put that in Bambi.
Dalí bought a fisherman's house, very, very simple, in Port Lligat, that's Cape Creus, and it's about 2 kilometers from Cadaqués. Dalí's paintings are inspired in that rocky formations of Cape Creus. It's a rocky landscape, very desertic, very blue sky, very powerful. Everything is very clear. That's in Dalí's work, this objectiveness.
This was his chosen landscape. This was the site of almost all his paintings. That was really felt he belonged, but also where he was able to restore his creative energies. He spent every summer painting back in Port Lligat.
Walt Disney's mission in his young 20s was to take this form of animation, essentially a bunch of gags and jokes and crudely drawn characters.
First time I met Mickey, he was a hungry-looking young mouse playing in his first movie. He was so poor that he didn't even own a pair of shoes.
And refine it to make the characters fuller.
Good morning.
To give them personality. Characters in animation were not just drawings. They were breathing, living, feeling things. And Walt Disney's mission was to elevate the form, the medium of animation, into art. Walt Disney had many, many qualities that obviously made the company into the great empire that it ultimately became. But one of the qualities he had very early on was making everybody believe that they were part of his mission.
Yeah, it's me, I guess.
The mission of perfection.
In 1929, Dalí held his first exhibition in Paris. He was very well accepted by the surrealist group. The surrealist group needed a person who was provocative, and Dalí was the man. There he also met a lot of American influential people like Alfred Barr, the director of the MoMA, Julian Levy, an important art dealer.
Levy came back to the United States with that famous painting, Persistence of Memory. He paid $250 for it, and he exhibited it in his gallery.
Dalí became the most talked about of the surrealist artists.
When the group of surrealists come to visit this extraordinary young man in his home lair in Cadaqués, he falls in love with Gala Éluard, the wife of the great surrealist poet, Paul Éluard.
Gala left her husband, and Dalí marries her.
And Gala changes his trajectory in all sorts of very, very significant ways. Gala was a stabilizing influence on him.
Gala was his muse, his model. She was a very cultivated woman, but also she took care of economy, of all agreements. They made a good team.
In the 1930s, Walt Disney was considered a genius on the level of Chaplin and Eisenstein in terms of filmmaking, and he was considered a great innovator of a new kind of visual language.
One of the things that Walt Disney was absolutely determined to do is to make artists out of animators. He instituted a permanent instruction course at the studio, an instruction course in fine art. It was Walt's theory that there was no distinction between animation and fine art.
As his animators got better, he started to try to use the medium in ways that had not been seen before, in telling stories where he started to use more abstract imagery.
throughout the 1930s, Walt used the silly symphonies as his testing ground. Here was where he could test different types of effects, different types of characters than he was putting into the Mickey Mouse cartoons.
Walt Disney was not just a film studio head. Walt Disney was a brand name.
Salvador Dalí was as much an icon as Walt Disney was, an icon of modern art.
Dalí really loved movies, and he especially loved the newsreels that preceded the films. Now, the Disney cartoons, I think he recognized in the Silly Symphonies the potential for surrealism in animation.
Walt Disney was someone that was really changing the whole field of animated cartoons.
Dalí had a lot of interest in cinema because at a very early age he knew that that would be the language of the 20th century.
If we look back at sort of Dalí's earliest surrealist style paintings, there was a kind of cinematic dimension to his paintings. There was the notion of narrative already there. He had become a close friend of a filmmaker, Luis Buñuel, and early in 1929, he and Buñuel made the famous film An Andalusian Dog, which was immediately picked up by the smartest avant-garde circles in Paris.
And later on, they created L'Isdor. They are both the most important surrealist film. They created powerful images, very strong, very provocative, and Dalí discovered that he wanted to be a filmmaker.
He loved a lot of the things that were coming out of Hollywood. His early paintings, I think you could easily argue, have a lot of qualities that come directly from the cinema.
Dalí came to America for the first time in 1934. Julian Levy had a small gallery on 57th Street and invited him to show his work. When he first came over on the boat with his wife, Dalí was met by a publicist who hissed to him, "They can make you or break you," meaning the press. So he immediately launched into a story about doing a portrait of his wife with pork chops on her arms.
Because he said, I love my wife, I love meat, I mix the two things I love the most.
And the press went nuts, and it was sort of this love affair between him and the press ever since. Dalí kept coming back to the United States almost every year.
Each time that he arrived at the States, he made a of happening. He asked people to create a long loaf of bread, and then when he arrived in the States, all the press talk about that.
Dalí was the greatest marketer in his field the way Disney was in his.
By the early 1930s, Walt Disney was already beginning to sense that he had gone about as far as he could go with the short form. By 1933, he had hatched the idea that he was going to make a feature film, Snow White. Something that would be radically different than the kinds of animations he had been making. One that would be advancing this idea of perfection. One that would have a real story to it, not just a series of gags. One that would have real emotion. Clearly, if he was going to elicit that kind of response, he was going to have to create much more realistic characters, much more realistic backgrounds, a much more realistic palette than the kind of bold colors that had been in the Mickey Mouse and Silly Symphonies. Nobody had ever thought in terms of what it would entail emotionally, narratively, visually. And Walt Disney did. When Snow White was premiered, the response was overwhelming. When Snow White was on the bier and the dwarves were watching her, crying, the audience began to weep. And that's when Walt knew he had achieved exactly what he wanted to achieve. Everyone now recognized his cultural status. He was only 36 years old. He got the cover of Time magazine.
Salvador Dalí was described by Time magazine as the surrealissimo. He had his picture on the cover of Time, 1936. 1936 was a big year for him because he came with not only a one-man show at the Julian Levy Gallery in New York, but also he was part of this big show at the Museum of Modern Art, which was called Fantastic Art, Dada and Surrealism. And Disney had 2 cells in that exhibit as well. So Disney and Dali were connected in the fall of 1936.
By the mid-30s, Walt Disney was already attracting a tremendous amount of attention from intellectuals who kind of adopted Walt Disney as this wonderfully naive folk artist who just has his finger on the American pulse.
Everybody wanted to meet the man who had created these wonderful characters.
Walt was a great attraction for many people in all different kinds of arts. He was friends with the Marx Brothers. His interest in classical music led to a meeting with Stokowski. George Balanchine visited during Fantasia. He had lectures at the studio with people like Frank Lloyd Wright. The studio was a lodestone for all of the arts at that time.
Walt was just plain folks at the studio and at home with his family. But there was the side that socialized and lived in a bit of that Hollywood lifestyle.
He liked to go to parties. He liked to hobnob with Hollywood stars. He had his picture taken with Spencer Tracy and Laurel and Hardy. He liked to play polo. Very Hollywood thing in those days. Dali went to California in 1937 for the first time with his wife Gala, and he immediately looked up Harpo Marx because he thought that he was one of the great surrealists of the cinema.
Dali wanted to meet Harpo Marx and to make some portrait of him. So he sent Harpo Marx an harp, but a special kind of harp with barbed wire. So Harpo Marx said, okay, you can make a portrait of me, I will play your harp. And they become friends.
He wrote to André Breton, who was the founder of Surrealism in Paris, I have come to Hollywood and I am in contact with the 3 great American surrealists, the Marx Brothers, Cecil B. DeMille, and Walt Disney.
Dali said Walt was one of the great American surrealists.
Given the enormous numbers of art influences that go into the Disney films, surrealism was inevitable. And if you look at the Disney films and you look at Dali's paintings, you can perhaps make some comparisons here.
The first Surrealist Manifesto in 1924 emphasized the notion that in dreams and in certain kinds of non-controlled speech or writing, you actually have a glimpse of the way in which the unconscious mind works. Freud talked about the dream condensing 2 or 3 different things into one.
Dali was very interested in a kind of morphology, one thing changing to another, or one thing obviously containing other images that reveal themselves if you stared at it long enough.
Dali was interested in chains of connected images, things that could symbolize something else.
He created the concept of double image or invisible image. Was his paranoical critical method. It's a mixture of what you see and what you think at the same time.
Surrealism fit with the way Walt saw reality. Albert Herder, who was a great designer at Disney's, his strength was seeing the hidden similarities in 2 objects and making one look like the other.
Even if you look at some of the early Mickey Mouse cartoons where everything animates, it seems so simple, almost primitive today, but it was pretty innovative.
The wonderful thing about animation is anything you can think up, you can do.
and it from one artist's hand, which is very interesting. And once you allow yourself to use two-dimensional animation and come from the pen or the brush of an artist, you're already taking a step beyond reality. It's surreal because the technique itself allows you to be much more imaginative and creative.
There's so many surrealistic sequences in those early films. Pink Elephants on Parade is extraordinary and would be worthy of anybody's wildest dreams.
And also flying keyboards and floating keys. I see a real influence of Salvador Dalí in that.
Here's a quote from Dalí. "My ambition is to give the world of the imagination the same degree of objectivity and reality as the everyday world." Well, that sounds like a quote from Walt Disney. And that was sort of his philosophy as well, that he took the imagined world and made it real for audiences.
There are hidden similarities every place. Things that look like or remind us of things that they certainly are not. Many of his gags are based on that, and Dalí was a master of that.
There are all sorts of ways in which Dalí was naturally inclined to the world of animation, in which I think he really did see as one of the ideal mediums for realizing his particular take on surrealism. I think he saw animation as the medium of the future.
Walt Disney was looking forward to the future all the time and trying to see how new developments and other art forms could be used in his art form, animation.
Now, after Snow White and its tremendous success, Walt's ambitions grew. He and Stokowski began to collaborate on a cartoon of Sorcerer's Apprentice. That ultimately expanded into what became known as Fantasia. Walt Disney, who was a popular artist, was now reaching across the aisle, so to speak, to a high artist. The art critic Robert Hughes said that the moment when Mickey Mouse shakes hands with the conductor, Leopold Stokowski, is the moment when high art and low art converge.
In 1939, Dalí did an exhibit at the World's Fair called The Dream of Venus. Time magazine said that The Dream of Venus should win more converts to surrealism than a dozen highbrow exhibitions.
Dalí really didn't make a distinction between so-called high art and popular art.
Bonwit Teller, who was on Fifth Avenue there, had given him a commission to design 4 windows in a surrealist style to coincide with his opening of his exhibit.
But the store changed some pieces. And then Dalí became furious. He said, "I'm an artist. You have not respected my work of art."
He dashed into the display was in the window, and he pushed the bathtub, and he pushed it too far, and he and the bathtub ended smashing the windows at Bonwit and ending up on the street. Well, this resulted in him going to jail for a few hours, which ended up getting him a ton of publicity, so he became even more notorious.
The press was fascinated by him. They covered everything he did, and he loved every minute of it.
He was like an actor. He was the first artist to be so conscious of the power of mass media and advertising and cinema and Hollywood.
Dalí was a great showman. Walt was a great showman. I think they saw that in each other, this uncommon ability to promote themselves.
I think that's one of the reasons why the two men got along so well. Given his propensity for self-promotion, Dalí probably would have loved to have his very own newsreel.
The Dalí News. Time stretches on. All the news artist Salvador Dalí wants you to see. Dateline Europe, 1940. As war spreads across the continent, world-famous surrealist painter Salvador Dalí flees to the safety of the United States, eventually taking up residence at the Del Monte Lodge in Pebble Beach, California, whose rugged landscape reminds him of his beloved Catalonia. There he continues to paint and amass greater and greater fame.
In 1941, Dalí put on a party at a place in Pebble Beach called A Night in a Surrealist Forest.
It was a very famous party in the Del Monte Lodge. He organized all the backdrop, the scenery.
This was to establish himself and his wife Gala as socially desirable on the West Coast. People like Bob Hope, Ginger Rogers, Bing Crosby all came up to Pebble Beach for the party. Hollywood people loved it, and he became very popular here in Los Angeles.
With the success of Snow White, Walt went right into Fantasia. He went into Pinocchio. He went into Dumbo. He went into Bambi. But the years those films came out was right at the beginning of World War II. And this was causing intense problems for Walt Disney. Snow White had made half of its profit in foreign countries. And suddenly, the foreign markets for the Disney films are all cut off.
The studio wasn't producing the kind of income that the Bank of America thought it should be producing. And once America entered the war, almost all of the production at the studio was shifted to making training films for various government services.
The artists, half of them went off to war, and Walt was making a lot of training films and propaganda films, and none of them for profit, believe me.
One of the few films that the Bank of America allowed to be kept into production during the war was Bambi. Everything else was shut down. The war and the Bank of America took 4 prime years out of Walt Disney's creative life.
From the 1940s on, Dalí was remarkably eclectic in the kind of mediums he chose to work in.
He wrote novels, theater, poetry, scripts for the cinema, essays. He designed furniture, dresses. He worked for publicity.
He was a Renaissance man. He designed costumes and sets for ballets. He painted pictures of the rich and famous.
They went to a lot of parties. The social life was very important for Dalí because at this period he painted a lot of portraits.
The portraits that Dalí did were for money, basically. He could make a lot of money by doing portraits of men and women, famous and rich, in Dalí-esque landscapes.
When the war ended, Walt Disney saw the opportunity to do new things, to flex his muscles, to be artistic again.
After World War II, the studio was in financial difficulties, and it was very hard to make feature-length films of the Snow White or Bambi kind. They were making these compilations of short cartoons, which typically were not as elaborately produced as the feature films.
After 4 years of training movies and government films of various kinds, the Disney style had begun to change, because to have animated those films in the old Disney style would have been prohibitively expensive. So those films were much simpler, much more angular, in some ways much more abstract than the great Disney animations.
Walt was starting to take short subjects and put them together to make what eventually became known as the package pictures.
Big Mind Music and Melody Time, they were all collections of bits and pieces of shorts.
When you go from Mickey Mouse to Three Caballeros, what you see is Walt Disney's cultural range. Walt Disney always somehow had his finger on the American pulse. It was really one of his most extraordinary talents.
Dali wanted to be always in the media because that way everybody talk about Dali. He wanted to create a newspaper that talks just on him. His past projects, his present projects, especially the future. And he published 2 issues of Dali News, one in 45, one in 47. He wrote the issues, illustrated them.
It's in the Dali News. He talks about Hitchcock wanting him for Spellbound.
My movie agent, an excellent friend, Fefe, ordered a nightmare from me by telephone. It was for the film Spellbound.
He told Dali, "You are the painter of dreams. I want you to be the painter of Gregory Peck's dream."
Those people, they do dream sequences in films, make it all sort of fuzzy and unclear, whereas what he wanted was the absolute sharpness and clarity of a dream. And he thought that's what Dali's paintings did.
They had a good relationship, but Dali created a long scene.
He wanted grand pianos hung from the ceiling, people dancing underneath. They couldn't actually create some of the sequences because it was too expensive, too mammoth, too difficult.
Sometime in 1944, Walt had seen a book of Dali's paintings on the desk of Mark Davis, one of his animators, and Walt asked to take it home. And he did, and later he bought a copy himself and sent it to Dali to have it autographed, which Dali did.
Personal contact between Dali and Walt Disney occurred around 1945 when he was working on Spellbound. They met at a party at Jack Warner's. He was painting Jack Warner's wife's portrait at the time, Anne Warner. He also painted Jack Warner's portrait, and Jack Warner looked at it and put it in the dog kennel.
Walt was totally intrigued with this guy when he met him, and Salvador Dalí was totally intrigued with Walt Disney, and they hit it off very well right from the very beginning.
Disney and Dalí have a conversation about, gee, wouldn't it be great to work together? And sure enough, Walt Disney follows through, and a contract was drawn up.
Dalí came in and they made a deal to produce a short subject.
And in early 1946, Dalí starts to report to the studio every day.
One of the great things with Walt was he always wanted to do something different. So having Salvador Dalí come to the studio and essentially apply his surrealistic techniques to animation, it seems like a natural leap to me.
In some odd way, they needed one another. Dalí wanted to be a popular artist who still retained the idea of being a high artist. Walt Disney was a popular artist who wanted the esteem of the high artist. So in a way, this was a match made in heaven.
Walt came in one day and he said, "I was out to dinner last night to my friend Jack Warner's house, and he's got that Spanish artist, Salvador Dalí, staying in his house. And I asked Dalí if he'd like to do some work for me. And Dalí said he would. So he'll be over day after tomorrow. And I'm going to bring him to you because I think you can handle the thing."
I was in luck, all right, because he was an extraordinary person to share subsequent many months with.
John Hench had attracted Walt's attention through his intellect and his artistic sensibilities. And so he assigned him to follow through with the production with Dalí, working with him directly.
I had started with story development, but I was curious about the business and what made it tick. So I sort of transferred myself into layout and then into background painting and then into several other areas that Walt must have been aware of.
Walt really trusted John Hench to understand what he wanted. By putting John Hench in with Dalí, it was as close as Walt could get to putting himself in with Dali on a day-to-day basis.
It may have something to do with my French, he thought would help. My French wasn't any worse than his English.
Dali was given free rein to come up with the subject.
And the project they decided to collaborate on was an animation of a Mexican folk song, which Walt had scored at the studio called Destino.
Dali selected the title because he was interested in Destiny. He thought the music must be good.
With the work being done on Saludos Amigos and Three Caballeros, they were looking at the cultural sounds and sights of our neighbors to the south. And so it's quite natural that a song like Destino, this Mexican love ballad, would have come to the Disney studio in some fashion.
Walt and Salvador Dalí really nurtured the press, and this was a great coup for both of them. Walt Disney, the master of cartoons, goes surreal, and Salvador Dalí goes to animation. The press had a ball with it. Dalí said things that were rather incomprehensible but amusing.
This is a magical exposition of the problem of life in the labyrinth of time.
Walt Disney kept trying to convince you of the reality of his characters.
Just a simple love story. Boy meets girl.
The first day on the job, John Hench brought Dalí a stack of animation bond paper to work with. And Dalí refused it. He said, "No, I can't work with this." And he held it up, and it, of course, animation bond at that time had 5 holes in the bottom to register it. And he said, "No, it already has a design."
We shared a table and the space, and he was very prompt.
Like a regular working guy, 9 to 5.
We were working on a storyboard, so mostly we drew. He used pen and ink and different sorts of pencils until we had the storyboards fairly well spotted that he started to do some painting.
Dalí would make basic drawings of the story as he saw it, based on the music of Destino. And then John would try to find continuity within that, from one image to another.
He had the concept in his head. It changed sometimes, all right, but the difficulty he had was getting from one sequence to another, and that was my job.
Dalí never had that kind of a discipline on him. He did what he did purely because that's who he was and it was his art.
He usually set the mood and the setting and the props, as it were, to indicate what he thought the message was in each sequence. Then I had to take over with the same setup and try and work out some way of getting to the next one. And that seemed to satisfy him.
They did lots of story sketches. Dalí would come in every day, sometimes with completely new ideas. And Walt loved that he did that. Walt loved that he would take things off into new directions. And then there was John Hench left trying to tie everything together and make something cohesive out of it.
What we know about the relationship between Walt Disney and Salvador Dalí in terms of their correspondence is that they loved one another. Dalí couldn't say enough about the genius of Walt Disney.
Very dear friend, good day. I have not ceased to imagine things for Destino. It must be the miraculous fusion of living action and cartoon. I have found a new idea 1,000 times more spectacular for the Temple of Love. I am sending from New York an explanation in watercolor to John Hench. My affections to Mrs. Disney and yourself, dear friend. Your friend, Salvador Dalí.
Walt was constantly praising the inventiveness, the genius of Salvador Dalí. Ideas just pour out of him, Walt said.
Dear Gala and Dalí, I am am happy to know that you are both so thrilled over Destino. We are not going to let the pressure of time stop us from getting something that will be worthy of Dali's talents. If we can find the time, Mrs. Disney and I would be happy to visit you again. My best wishes to you both, and looking forward to a successful adventure with Destino. Sincerely, Walt Disney.
Dali was a very sincere person, but apparently very absent-minded. His wife, Gala, would have to pin directions on him so that he could get from one place to another. He couldn't drive a car. He had to have drivers. And he couldn't figure out the difference between 300 and 1,000. He was constantly asking, what's the difference between 300 and 1,000?
John Hench was a tremendous draftsman, and John's particular skills enabled him to take the ideas that Dali was coming up with and to try to absorb Dali's style. Many years later, in looking at some of the pictures that had been drawn, some by Dali and some by John Hench, even Dali couldn't tell the difference between the ones he had done and the ones John Hench had done.
Destino is filled with a lot of Dali symbols, the visual motifs that run through his work.
We have to know all Dali's work till the 40s to understand all the imaginary that's in Destino. All Dali is in there.
There is a profound melancholy in many of Dali's best paintings of the 30s. In Destino, there is a very strong sense of nostalgia, of something that is almost within reach and then is lost again.
It's a love story. It's the awakening of love between two people. He started out with destiny being a matter of time. So there was some symbols of time that the male protagonist was eventually associated with. They were both dancers. The girl's head becomes like a dandelion, and this essence of her is floating all over everywhere. There were phases of a love affair that were being developed, and being together and being separated. It was kind of a ballet of the destiny of love.
That film is about a longing so intense, it's really in the song. And it's Dora Luz, I fell in love with her when I saw The Three Caballeros. It says, "My empty arms are filled now, as they were meant to be."
In Destino, you see a lot of references to time. This famous melting clocks is also in the film.
I said, "What do they mean?" He said, "Well, it means that sometimes you're waiting for somebody, the time stretches and becomes a long time. Other time you're having a good time and time's very fast."
Turtles were another form of time. They were supposed to be very slow.
The scene of the two heads marching towards each other, meeting, and then their profiles creating a ballet dancer. I think that's very Dalinian. The animated paranoid image, if I could call it that, the way it actually can change before your eyes.
These various experiences with the outside world, fame and money and alcohol, these things attempted to stop her. They were blockages. Then there's a baby. There was maternity was another that she avoided. He had designed a labyrinth of different forms that the two protagonists, the girl and the guy, were separated. The male protagonist was lost in this labyrinth, and he was searching for a way out, and was full of huge statuary. Jupiter's head was the barrier, and then the hummingbird opened it again. The hummingbird is in several ways, Dali said, the poetic key to a solution. He says that hummingbird is a symbol of poetry, which only takes out the essence of anything. The telephone was the communication of ideas. Antelopes, this kind of a rush of animal spirits, I guess, the maturing of a certain aspect of physical being.
Dali painted quite often one of his cousins jumping rope, and then he converted this image into a veil of a church. So that's present in Destino.
Crutch is an old symbol of his that he made out of the idea that furniture, chairs and cabinets and everything were crutches, that we were really prosthetic people. We need all kinds of things to hold us together. This is near the end when he wanted to be a kind of region of heart in this big citadel or temple. He thought it was a ballet, and since these two protagonists were dancers, there was to be in this reconciliation after being together like a baseball game. And the girl's head was the ball.
It is a little strange. But what you got to remember is that where the ball goes is straight into this catcher's mitt, which becomes his heart.
Salvador Dalí and John Hench were well into their work on Destino toward the end of 1946. And by this time, film distributors were hoping that Walt would get back into doing full-length features again.
I'd heard that our releasing agents didn't want any more of the package pictures. So I thought if I'd shoot a little test, Walt might be intrigued to go ahead with it. I didn't have any animators, so I got him to paint on 2 sliding cells, and he had already done a background. So I thought, well, I'd shoot it on the multiplane camera. I just slide 2 figures together. When they touched, the negative space between them would be the involvement of the girl. I shot the thing. I sneaked it into the projector at that little theater they have in Carmel, where Dali was at the time. And he was waiting till all the people went out and put on the picture. And I didn't know if the manager of the theater was watching it, because after the thing had flashed on and off, I heard this big voice, "My God, what was that?" And so I thought, well, that'll be good. I'll show that to Walt.
There's been a lot of speculation about why Destino never got made. One opinion has it that the vogue for package films was over, although Melody Time was released a couple of years after they started this project, and it wasn't in it. The other theory is that this was so bananas a project that Walt just couldn't release it. Perhaps Dali was too strong a design for Disney. Disney had to put his own mark onto whatever he did, and the fear was that it was too much Dali and too little Disney.
This is one of the descriptions of what happened at the studio, and this is by Jim Bedrero, a social friend of Dali's as well as an artist at Disney's. One Monday I arrived at the studio and I found this note on my desk, called Violet, Walt's secretary. Violet said, "Have you been down in the Dali unit lately? The boss is down there and he's blowing his top and yelling and screaming for you." I went down there and Walt said, "Take a look. All the beautiful, moody drawings of the girl were gone, and the place was covered with the most beautiful drawings of baseball players." Dali turned up and Walt said, "What the hell's all this baseball?" Dali said, "Nice, huh?" Walt said, "What's it got to do?" Failing off into a high-pitched sound of frustration. Dali said, "The regard of God, the regard of the universe." Walt said, "What do you mean?" Dali said sometimes they lie down like this in regard, sometimes with both hands they regard, sometimes they take a stake in regard, but always regarding. He just said it was inspiring, all these men looking at the sky. Walt said $70,000 gone down the drain, and he said it was the end. Call it off, pay him off.
Ultimately, all that remained of Destino were the sketches done by John Hench and Salvador Dalí and some original, beautiful paintings, and 17 seconds of test animation. And the project was shelved, and everything lay unseen, unused.
If you look back on Dali's projects, it's extraordinary how many things he got involved in, tremendous enthusiasm. They didn't work out. So it's curious how one thinks of him in terms of most famous artist in the 20th century, possibly after Picasso. And many of his most cherished projects never actually reached the final completed state.
I think the relationship of Dali with cinema, it's a kind of frustration. He had two big projects with Luis Buñuel, and from then on, he looked for a big film or even being a filmmaker, but that couldn't be. I think it's not a romantic story, that of Dali and cinema.
Dali was desperately homesick for his house in Port de Gat. He wanted to get home to Spain. He wanted to get back to the little house that he lived in with Gala since the early 1930s and where he'd spent his childhood holidays.
Even though nothing happened with the Destino project in 1946, the friendship between Walt Disney and Salvador Dalí would continue for many years.
Artists have a tendency to understand one another on some level that we mere mortals don't, and they clearly had some kind of a connection that way.
Dali visited Walt's home a number of times, and there's a set of photographs that show Dali sitting on this caboose with Ward Kimball driving Walt Disney's model train around his property. They remained in touch with each other. Walt Disney visited with Salvador Dalí in Spain.
They continued even to discuss projects.
Don Quixote had been a subject study for Disney for many years. It would have been something that would have appealed to Dalí.
I'm sure Walt said, look, your name is golden. I'm not gonna waste it on Destino. Disney Dalí, Don Quixote, that's what it should be.
But alas, there was never to be a collaboration between Walt Disney and Salvador Dalí.
Stretches on. All the news artist Salvador Dalí wants you to see. Dateline 1948. After 8 years in exile, world-famous surrealist painter Salvador Dalí departs the United States for his home in Port de Gat, Spain, leaving behind his unfinished collaboration with Hollywood legend Walt Disney.
Ever since Dalí and Disney signed the contract to produce the first motion picture of the never-seen-before, the most rigorous secrecy on this subject has prevailed. In Walt Disney's studio reigns a silence, like the silence of the mysterious place where the cyclotron is guarded.
The art was filed away, as was art from every other unfinished project, in the basement of the animation building then called the morgue.
Morgue, in the newspaper business, means a place where they keep used but usable material. On our morgue, these shelves, tables, and file cabinets hold all of the drawings, the models, sketches, and background for every film we've ever made.
The real morgue wasn't quite as tidy as Walt's soundstage version.
It was down in the basement of the ink and paint building and under leaky water pipes, and there were big signs saying, "Beware of the spiders."
Art was stored from floor to ceiling. You had floors that were sometimes covered with rain.
It was not a very wholesome place to store this very valuable artwork.
The project disappeared so deeply that there were old-timers of the studio that when they came upon the art many years later in the archives, they didn't even realize that Dali had been here working.
After Walt's death, there was starting to be some thought around the studio that there are elements of Walt Disney's history that are forgotten, and we should be preserving all these things. One of the things that came out of this was the start of the Walt Disney Archives, founded in 1970. And one of the first things that was brought over to me to take care of was the batch of Dali art for Destino.
Eventually, when the Animation Research Library was built, much of that art went back to its care because they then had the state-of-the-art protection.
Disney's Animation Research Library archives all of the company's animation art dating back to 1920 through present day, about 60 million pieces of art. For the Destino film, we have 150 pieces of art. There are 5 paintings, 70 story sketches and developmental pieces that were drawn by Salvador Dalí, and another 75 that were drawn by John Hench.
When we moved the Destino art into the archives, various people in the organization were intrigued by it. It was Roy Disney that was really intrigued with doing something with Destino.
Fantasia had always been my favorite of Walt's movies. Walt said, Fantasia is the best idea I ever had because it's an endless project.
Fantasia 2000 was the continuation of Walt's vision of having this ever-changing film that would always be going out there with new pieces in it. While I was working on that project, Roy said, let's do one of the interstitials on the Disney that never was.
Destino was one of those that there was a lot of artwork produced, but never a film. So I went and got a few pieces of art.
Each piece you looked at, you were just, holy smokes, this is unbelievable. And you just put that aside, and here comes another piece that's even more magnificent.
We'd had it for 50 years, gathering dust. Something went ding in my head, and I thought, well, wait a minute, what if we make the film now?
And the next thing you knew, we were being charged with finishing Destino.
Working with those storyboards, you could do it about 18 different ways. Once I decided I was going to do this, it got more emotional as it went forward. I was going around to everybody saying, look, here's this opportunity to do something really unusual. I got a lot of resistance about it, and I really kind of just went ahead and did it anyway.
One of the first hurdles that had to be dealt with was, what was the original artistic intent? What did Salvador Dalí and John Hench envision? What was the storyline that they were going for? And we were very fortunate because John Hench still worked at the company. He was in his early 90s and was sharp as a tack.
John was an unbelievable help to us.
The hummingbird, which is, according to him, is a symbol of poetry, because a hummingbird only takes the essence of the flower.
He kind of guided us through that first storyboard series of tries and failures and finally getting it into a continuity.
You're having a truck in this?
Yeah, a truck out, exactly. Yeah, so we painted out the background.
In modern day animation, we have numbered our story sketches for many years so that we can, from drawing to drawing, make sure we have the right continuity. But these sketches weren't numbered, and so there was a lot of debate about the correct running order.
There was a lot of head scratching that was going on, but ultimately Don Ernst, our producer on Fantasia 2000, figured out the sequence of drawings. We normally pin up our storyboards on a 4-foot by 8-foot board, and you go from top row by row down, and then you go to your next storyboard. And what Don had realized was that actually they had worked it so that you pinned across 2 storyboards and then started over again and went across.
It was like the Rosetta Stone. Suddenly there was a story there that we could somewhat comprehend. The first thing you do with any animated film is to make a story reel. So we took these story sketches and filmed them and laid them in against the soundtrack. And I was kind of amazed to find that there actually was a story there. John Hinch went, yeah, that's it.
Roy sat down with me and we screened the 8.5-minute story reel, and I was blown away. We started thinking about who should direct it.
A branch of our animation studio was over in Paris, and it was an incredibly talented guy named Dominique Monfray.
Dominique Monfray and the Paris studio had been contributing to our movies for 10 years, doing minutes of each of our big 2D releases. We flew over and hit it off right away.
Roy explained me the project of Destino and saying that they wanted to give me the direction of the project. First I was very proud, then I was very anxious because for me the two names, Salvador Dalí and Walt Disney together on a project made me a little nervous, and my first feeling was it was too abstract, too surrealist, and it's something that I don't have the feeling with. When he briefed me on this first idea, I feel that idea too cartoony, not very in the spirit of Destino.
I remember getting back on the plane going, oh, please, God, please take this movie. His thoughts were interesting and provocative in response to the story reel.
He really delved into studying Dali and his symbology so that he was connecting this tableau and that tableau with things that were actually Dali-esque.
A week or two went by, and I finally called him. I was so nervous. And I said, Dominique, have you thought about doing this? And he said yes.
La première fois que Roy Disney et Baker m'ont présenté le projet, je me sentais pas du tout, je connaissais pas vraiment le surréalisme. Et en fait, ce au départ est devenu pour moi un point fort, faire en sorte que le projet devienne beaucoup plus lisible au niveau de la narration.
We wrestled with the 8.5-minute story reel for 6 to 10 months because it wasn't telling a story. It was Dominique who said, you know what? I need to put my pencil to paper and redraw the entire movie so that I can get into Dali's head.
Je pense que Dali et Walt s'étaient arrêtés sur le projet sans trop savoir ce qu'ils voulaient aussi raconter. On avait quand même des notes de la femme de Dali à l'époque qui nous ont aidés à cibler un petit draft.
There was quite a thick notebook written by Dali's wife. He came home every night and told her what they did that day, and she would proceed to write it down. I think he told her something different every night, so there were like 40 versions of the same story.
Dominique spent 4 months redrawing the movie. He proposed a substantial edit in the piece, bringing it from 8.5 to just over 5 minutes. So we screened it. You want to just run with it, Dominique, and we'll be your audience?
Okay, so I will pitch you very quickly the main line of the story. The story starts with a naked woman who walks towards a pyramid.
And everybody in the room was kind of instantly thrilled with the cut.
Je suis content avec l'histoire parce que chacun voit ce qu'il a envie de voir. Dali disait que si jamais on comprenait le film, c'est qu'on avait raté le film. Moi, personnellement, ce qui m'a le plus charmé au départ, ça a été la musique. Ça m'a beaucoup donné d'inspiration. Ça m'a donné une vision de comment couper le film.
The music was originally planned for use in Three Caballeros, or one of the South American films. I love that it's being used in this film as it is.
The fact that a recording from 1945 was released on this movie is unique. When we started the movie, we weren't sure that this recording should stay.
When I first heard the song, I thought, Okay, we're going to re-record this, right? The original tracks were scratchy and a lot of pops.
It was just an acetate demo after all. That was probably made in 2 hours on the soundstage. We had an endless debate about whether to use that piece of music or whether to go back in and re-record it.
This is so authentic. To try to then duplicate something that is so unduplicatable.
Right.
This is a period recording with an amazing singer. And
yes.
We would be doing kind of a faux version of it, I think.
Yeah.
Even in the hands of the best musician.
We kept saying, we need this to be authentic, and can't we find ways to revive the tracks out of this scratchy old 78 RPM disc we had?
There was much time and energy spent on trying to restore it, to extract the scratches and the noise from the acetate.
Finally, it got to where I remember saying at some point, we need to put a needle drop at the front end of this thing. Just so that the audience understands that it's the old record and not some new recording.
Quand on va entendre ce style de musique, on va savoir que notre travail, on aura réussi à faire rentrer le spectateur par le biais de cette musique dans un univers qui est un peu plus bizarre, surréaliste, comme celui de Dali.
Part of the value of having it produced in Paris under Dominique's watch was that he would be able to draw and animate and supervise every part of it. He handpicked the best animators, layout artists, background painters, and developed with the art director, Thierry Fournier, the style of the film.
Au départ, ça n'a pas été une manière naturelle de passer de Dali à l'animation. Il a fallu qu'on trouve plusieurs astuces, comme certains techniquement des dégradés pour faire les décors. Le plus difficile a été pour les personnages.
La façon dont Dali posait les lumières sur les personnages dans ses peintures. Et on s'est rendu compte en fait qu'il y avait donc une lumière principale qui générait donc une ombre et que dans cette ombre il y avait une petite lumière secondaire. On a décidé de manière à préserver cette approche de peinture, donc d'avoir des personnages en animation qui n'avaient pas le contour de la ligne.
The only problem is how do you make a drawing look like a painting? We always have to think where the light is coming from. We used 2 levels. The first level is going to be the cleanup level where we're going to clean up the rough animator's drawing. And then we add a second level, the shadow parts. All the line work is going to disappear and we are only going to use colors.
Donc on révélait le volume des personnages grâce à leurs mouvements en générant une lumière et une ombre. Notre décision de créer ce genre d'image de manière à se coller au mieux à la façon dont Dali peignait ses peintures.
There was a lot of debate on the designs of him and her. If you look at the original Dali and Hench sketches, there is a range of design from drawing to drawing. Dominique, being a great designer, spent weeks playing with the designs.
Là, ici, on a des dessins qui nous ont aidés à trouver l'identité de cette femme. Là, on se rend compte que c'était une danseuse.
Dominic presented to us like 20 different designs of a woman. He had extracted from each of Dali and Hench's drawings different ideas. He wanted to fall in love with this woman.
Je préférais avoir quelque chose d'encore moins sexy, encore moins belle. Parce que Dali, quand il peint des femmes, ce ne sont pas des top modèles, ce sont des femmes de tous les jours. Donc on a vraiment cherché à ne pas tomber dans le stéréotype de la femme parfaite.
Similarly, in the original Dali and Hench sketches, the man, he was even more vague.
Pendant que Chronos essaye de se détacher du temps, le temps essaye de le rattraper pour le ramener sur la pyramide. Donc vous avez là l'illustration un peu de ce qui avait été fait en 1946 et ensuite on l'a adapté.
The guy needs to reflect the cold and callous environment from which he breaks.
Pour moi, c'est une histoire d'amour entre un homme et une femme, mais ils ne peuvent trouver cet amour tant qu'ils n'ont pas réussi à avoir leur propre identité, surtout pour la femme. C'est pour ça que tout au long du film, elle porte différentes robes. Elle démarre nue, parce qu'elle n'a pas de personnalité. Ensuite, elle se met à rêver, mais dans son rêve, elle a une robe très transparente, et ce n'est pas la bonne robe, ce n'est pas sa vraie personnalité. Elle va finir par trouver sa véritable personnalité quand elle va arriver près de la pyramide, où elle va s'habiller d'une robe en forme de cloche. Et ça, c'est sa véritable personnalité.
One of Dali's preoccupations was with the subjective nature of time. And so that whole notion of her moving in these sort of little staccato bursts of action is about time.
At the beginning, it was an economic solution in order to do less drawing. But when we've done the first test in animation, it became really the spirit of Destino. Now, Cross Dissolve is a part of the aesthetic of the movie.
It's Dali-esque in an interesting way.
Il y avait un grand sens de la perspective et en fait, personnellement, moi j'avais envie de faire rentrer le spectateur dans le monde de Dali. C'est pour ça qu'on a utilisé la 3D. Les maquettes qu'on a réalisées pour mener à bien un travail en 3D sur le film, on voulait que Dahlia puisse marcher sur Babel Tower et que Babel tourne en même temps. Et sur ce chemin, elle rencontrait les portigueuses en fonction des dessins de Salvador Dalí ou de John Hench.
Dali's paintings have enormous amounts of depth, and so going to 3D and being able to circle things with the camera, I'm sure he would have loved it. Walt and Dali both would have embraced the computer.
On n'a pas cherché à faire un film que sur Dali. On avait aussi l'esprit de Walt Disney à mettre aussi dans ce film, de par l'animation et tout ça. Donc ce n'était pas seulement Dali, c'était Dali et Walt Disney.
This is really an honorary screening for John. The reason we're here today is really for you, John, since you had this major role in the creation of this motion picture.
When we showed John Hench the finished product, he said, "That's Destino. That was what was supposed to be."
John was not an easy guy to please. And when he got enthusiastic and said, "Wow, this is great, this is what we were trying to do," pleasing him was enormously rewarding.
He had one note for us. When the Frenchmen are riding bicycles on the palm of the hand, they're wearing baguettes for hats, and John said they weren't supposed to be baguettes, they were supposed to be rocks.
On top of the bicyclers, you've changed it to bread, which is probably a better idea than rocks.
So it was actually supposed to be rocks. We were always under the impression it was supposed to be baguettes. Did we get it wrong?
The Gala Dali Foundation in Spain are dedicated to preserving, nurturing the art of Dali. When we were finishing the film, I called Monsi Auger, who's a director at the foundation, and I said, "I'm calling you with regard to a collection of art and a film that we just finished. You must know I'm speaking of Destino." And you could have heard a pin drop. And she says, "Mr. Bloodworth, we have been inquiring about this for many years." And I said, "I'm happy to invite you to Los Angeles to come see it." She was on a plane in about 2 weeks and sat in the room with us. Roy and I were so nervous, and we watched the movie, and I was just holding my breath until Muncie said, "This is such a great tribute to Dali. He would have been very proud of this." After Muncie had returned to Spain, they called us back and said, "We are curating an important exhibit in Barcelona and want to include the art of the film, and the film will be screened and presented to the royal family."
I was a little nervous to bring Salvador Dalí back to Figueres, but it was a wonderful experience. Prince Felipe, Juan Carlos's son, came down. We ran the film for him, and he seemed to get a big kick out of it.
There's a terrific and important animation festival in Annecy, France, and Roy has long been a big supporter. We contacted Serge Bromberg, who is the director of the festival, and said, "We have this special movie," and he said, "I know this movie." Well, that has to premiere opening night.
Destino was very well received. It won prizes at a number of film festivals. But it all culminated in being nominated for an Academy Award.
I was just so happy for everybody, you know, because a lot of people put a lot of effort and love into this thing. It's such a validation to have the Academy and your peers recognize that this was something special.
When you think of this great collaboration between Walt Disney and Salvador Dalí, I think there's a certain kind of aesthetic justice in that. After all those years, and with the collaborators long dead, that essentially their ghosts got together again and completed the project.
It has the language of Disney on the level of feeling very engaging. But the ideas of Dali infiltrate every aspect of it. It's a really remarkable marriage.
Destino, qui a, je crois, sa propre personnalité, de par la combinaison de ces deux grands artistes, qui fait que, ben voilà, par respect, ben, ça a donné Destino.
It's not just a short cartoon. This is a moving piece of art. This wasn't a commercial venture. This was art for art's sake.
I know the satisfaction that Roy feels. What a gift to give his uncle. What a gift to give his father. What a legacy for all the Disney files that ever were, finishing this piece in honor of Walt.
The really great thing about Disney is that nothing ever goes away. Nothing ever goes to waste. Projects get started, they get put aside, they age. They're just sleeping. They're waiting for the prince to come and wake them up with the right kiss.
is real now. My empty arms are filled now, as they were meant to be. For you came along, out of a dream I recall. Yes, you came along to answer my call. I know now that you are my destino. We'll be as one, for we know our destiny. Along out of a tree.